Welcome to the Ad Astra podcast. In this episode, we are talking with researcher Alexandre Tür. Alexandre is a curator at the Bibliothèque nationale de France in the Department of Manuscripts, a very lucky position, and we must say. He has, recently in 2018, completed his PhD research on the astrology of the 15th century, the astrological practices of the 15th century, and his thesis is entitled Hora, introitus, solis in Arietem, les prédictions astrologiques annuelles latines dans l'Europe du XVe siècle, 1405-1484. So a research, a very interesting research, I must say, on all these predictive techniques and all this prediction of political events, of weather events, and all of this surrounding the revolutions of the year. So how did you decide to, welcome first of all. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Yes. And how did you reach this particular topic of research? What was your approach to it? I'm curious.
Well, it's complicated. I didn't come. It didn't come at once. But actually, at the beginning, I was looking for a topic on which would come in everyday life of the people in the end of the Middle Ages or the beginning of the modern era, and which astrological predictions are not. But after talking with Professor Jean-Patrice Boudet, he convinced me that there was lots of material on the subject, and there was an historiographical lack on studying this particular type of predictions as a genre, as a literary and astrological genre. And so I worked on it, and in the end, that's what I did.
Yes, and you worked mainly with manuscripts and manuscript traditions, or you also dealt with some publications? Because in your time frame, you will find both, I think, the beginning of the press and also the manuscript tradition.
The switch between manuscript and print is something very important, in my opinion, for this type of production, because it changes what prognostications, what yearly predictions are in the core. Not just when with the technique, but what comes next. I mean, when editors come in play and say, okay, we want to sell these predictions, and that's not exactly what astrologers wanted for annual predictions. So I first worked with manuscripts, and I made a quite exhaustive survey, well, as exhaustive as I could, of manuscripts, and I didn't go that far with printed materials because there were very much, even in the short period I'm working on, the first printed annual prediction we preserve is 1470s or 1471. Mm-hmm. But between 1471 and 1488, which is the publication of Lichtenberger's prediction, which changes lots of things. There are already as many prints as there are manuscripts between 1405 and 1484. So I tried to work on the numbers, on statisticals, and I studied a few printed prognostications, but I focused first on manuscripts.
Yes, mm-hmm. And all of them from the Bibliothèque nationale de France, or were you also comparing them with other?
No, I tried to have an extensive study on all the material available in European public libraries. So I probably missed a few. There are few I couldn't see, so I know they exist, but I couldn't analyze them much. But yes, I tried to work with all the material available, when I could.
Well, it's a very, very ambitious project. I saw parts of your material, and one thing that I am dying to ask you is because when we exchanged emails, you raised a few interesting historiographical questions, and one of them is, why was this material so carefully preserved? Because they were by nature transitory, so to say. And also because my PhD is not the same as yours, but it's kind of close to yours. And one of the manuscripts I studied is on the Bibliothèque nationale de France, and the other in Portugal, and they are both of the same author. And also in this manuscript, late 15th century, he includes some predictions, some other predictions from the 13th century. So why were they preserving, in your opinion, why were they preserving all this transitory, apparently they are transitory reports?
I think, well, I found out that it's very rare we are preserving the originals, in the sense that predictions that were actually sent from an astrologer through a prince, for instance, are very rarely preserved. We are preserving copies,
yes.
And mostly, not mostly, but very often, there are collectors were responsible for copying them, and or just collecting them. And obviously that changes the way we can analyze them, because it's very difficult to say that what we are preserving is representative of what was produced. We have some particularities that in the preservation. For instance, I don't know, the London astrologer Richard Ruisian that Sophie Page studied is a very particular case, because he wrote lots of annual predictions for himself, and we preserve his workbook. So it's very different than preserving copies that a collector, often humanist collectors, decided, oh, I like this prediction, and I like this one, but this one, oh, it's too small, so I won't copy it. And so on. But of course, even with collectors, we can see that different collectors have different priorities, and but it's something we need to be careful about, that we don't preserve the something that is representative of the prediction.
Yes, when I say preserving is like copying. It's a way of preserving not the original itself, but the information, preserving the information. And the other thing that I noticed, especially in the manuscript I've studied, is not only the care that was put in mentioning the sources for the doctrine, but also the sources, because he had a collection of horoscopes, also the sources for the horoscopes. So sometimes he says this comes from Conrad Eingarder, or comes from the I forgot the name, but this man who was the treasurer of the king. Or so we can see how the astrological information would circulate in not only in the court, in the circles, inner circles, but also in, I would call the outer circles, and they would circulate. So this is also another thing that the manuscripts can tell us. I don't know if you noticed this in the study that you have, because you're studying the ingress of the sun. So I don't know what.
It's well, the annual predictions are working as a coherent type of writing, of astrological writing, but there is also in the 15th century a degree of freedom for the astrologers, and some astrologers talk very much about the context in which they were writing, mostly in prologues and sometimes in dedications, because it was often given to a prince or an ecclesiastic. And others don't speak at all, and well, they don't want the context to have an influence over their prediction. So sometimes you have interesting elements of context, and sometimes you don't have anything. And if you don't have the author's name, it's not easy to know why it was written, when or where. When you normally have the year. But if the year is written out, or if you have just a part, it's not always that easy.
These predictions, I know they were meteorological, first of all, and then they were also regarding food and political events. So can you tell from an author to the other if the emphasis is more on the weather, or the emphasis is more in political events, or in any other thing, just from one to the other?
Yes, that's there are different focus depending on the astrologers, and there are different things they are prepared to do depending on whether in their production concept they think that the prediction will be accepted or not. It's predicting weather and even agriculture, food or diseases. It's quite okay at the time, because it's universal and it doesn't go against religion. It's widely accepted. When you begin to speak about princes and political events, you must be much more careful, because when you do when you're getting personal, you can have some difficulties, some theoretical difficulties to make the astrology accepted. And you can also have difficulties with the prince if he isn't satisfied with what you say. So you have to make sure you're protected enough in a political sense.
Yes, that would be also my question. How much of these predictions were conditioned by the need of pleasing the patron? Could be a prince or a duke, or the patron. So when it's weather, it's more or less harmless. But when it comes to political events, how many of these predictions were, I would say, adjusted to avoid problems?
Well, you have there's two things you can see in the predictions. Either there's a patron, a specific patron, and the predictions is written for him. So in that case, he often has a special treatment between all the princes. There's a prediction for major cities and princes in Europe, or in Italy, if it's an Italian prediction, for instance. And you see the client is better treated, and nothing wrong will happen to him, or he will vanquish anything wrong sent at him. Another type of predictions is predictions that I suppose were sent to several princes, and we can often see that astrologers stay prudent, and they try not to enter too much in political events or interpretation. They stay very close to what they can relate to their astronomical horoscopes. That's a thing we can see. In that case, actually, we wonder what the prince could deduce from the prediction, because there's not much to do with that. But it's not a prediction that is made for the personal use of one prince. It's more a sort of advertisement for what the astrologer could do, and then the interested prince is invited to have a meeting with the astrologer and to have his own predictions, which will be adapted to his own astrological features, and it will be something that is sold, in my opinion, to the astrologer. While the annual predictions, I think, is often freely given, or at least very cheap, just to show what the astrologer can do.
Yes, it's like a free sample of
exactly,
their work.
Exactly, that was a sample of the work.
Yes, and then if the prince or the duke or the patron was interested, then he would somehow contract pay the astrologer for more specific. That is a very interesting. Yes, and gives it a very good idea of the way it works, the patronage.
Yes. What the stimulus for patronage is obtained. Yes, and I was wondering also, did you find significant differences in methodologies or forms of presentation from kingdom to kingdom, or from region to region, or do you think there's a more or less homogeneous way of treating the subject at this time?
There's something special with Italy, probably because there's much more astrology made there at the time, and often Italian predictions are about Italy and not that much about the rest of Europe. But we also see that lots of astrologers are traveling, and lots are coming even from Poland to Italy, then to Spain and France, and that makes things quite homogeneous in the way they write their predictions.
They circulated.
Yes.
Another question that you raised when we were exchanging emails, and it's also a very, very interesting question. What makes these predictions scientific? What is the quality? And if, also repeating your question, were they perceived as scientific by the public, by the patrons, by all the other society? I would like to hear what you have to say.
That's a very interesting question that was raised during my research, because you would think that maybe the astrologers would be the one arranging themselves with their data to make the predictions they like and they know would adapt to the context. And in fact, I think the astrologers, and mostly in universities, are the ones that are more. They believe in the astrology doctrine, and they want to stay with the authorities. They don't want to leave much to their own interpretation. What they do is follow Al-Masar, Meshala, and so on. So in their mind, their predictions are very scientific, and to prove that, they quote the authorities, they name the authorities, and sometimes they quote it directly. On the other hand, the public, including the client, use astrology for diverse uses, and princes, for instance, don't always apply the predictions to their political decisions. It depends. Some princes use astrology, but it seems that a lot of them are using astrology as a sort of curial display of how learned they are. So they foster astrological studies, and they read the predictions, and they make sure that their own predictions are transmitted, are copied in their court. But in fact, it's not to use the astrological advice. It's much a sort of show. And even it seems that in some cases, that attitude towards astrology goes down from the prince to city elites, and who also like to cite predictions just to show their readers that they know of them, but not really to apply the advices.
It's more like propaganda, like an instrument for political propaganda.
It's a sort of propaganda, but not always political. There's a case. Monica Azzolini worked on Milan Court and how the Sforza used predictions and controlled the diffusion of annual predictions, especially predictions they think were not in their favor. So that's a very interesting case, because we still have sources that were confiscated by the Sforza. So we still have the predictions that circulated. That's, to my knowledge, a very rare case. In that case, that's very political. They didn't want anyone to think that something wrong, so that something bad could happen to them in the year, because, according to Monica Azzolini, that would encourage their opponents to act against them. Because, well, if it's going to happen, let's make it happen.
Exactly.
But we also see a sort of cultural display of astrology, not to justify their political actions, but just to show that they're cultivated, so they foster astrology. And
Yeah.
Yes, to show that they are acquainted with this knowledge that is, by then it was very prestigious in a way, because only physicians and mathematics and people with knowledge would be acquainted, and also separated from what they would call divination or superstition, so that they would put astrology, educated astrology, in another level, and then other forms of divination in a different level.
Yes, I was now thinking as I was hearing you speak. For the case of Portugal specifically, we don't have, as far as I know, this kind of prediction, at least preserved from the 15th century. We have it a bit from the 16th, 17th certainly, but then we have printed papers by then, so it's easier to at least to preserve and circulate. But we have very little, if any, of this kind of
what we have in the
predictions.
16th century. We had the king who was very young. He was like 24, and he decided to go to Morocco, present-day Morocco, to fight
King Sebastian.
King Sebastian, and he disappeared because he was outnumbered, and he just disappeared. And he was not a fighter; he was a kid, and it just disappeared.
Not a very good
strategical
move.
Yeah. So, and he had no children, and he was the last of his dynasty. Well, it was really complicated. But so when he disappeared, the problem is that the Spanish king, who was related to the Portuguese kings, would legally take the throne of Portugal, because of all the intermarriages. He was the legal king of Portugal, the next king. So, because people didn't want this to happen, they would go to his horoscope, to Sebastian's horoscope, and would predict his life span. So instead of dying at 24, he would live, I think, to 48 or to 50.
Least, yeah.
So he would return, and this became kind of a messianic culture. And there were signs, and every time something happened, they would say that the king will return. He didn't, not yet, at least, and we are still waiting. And we had the Spanish kings for 80 years.
Yes.
And then we had
60.
what we call the Restoration, and again, when a new Portuguese king expelled the Spanish kings and assumed the throne of Portugal, they used astrology again to make it
to promote and
to promote
to
it. Yeah.
legitimize the shift in power. Yes, but this is all 16th,
16th century and
17th
17th
century,
century.
and then you can observe a lot of activity. The 15th century, for some reason, doesn't have a lot of records. Probably we would suspect that these kind of predictions would circulate at least with the kings and the high nobility, but so far in the documentation,
We have
there's
few,
nowhere.
in my MA, I studied whatever we have in Portugal, and we have a few in the 14th century, yes, and then really not much in the 15th century.
But not documents, you have chronicle reports.
Oh yes,
right?
just chronicles, not documents itself
Yes.
themselves.
Which leads me to think, taking the case of Portugal as an example, was it because these things didn't existed so much, or would they have a specific, a very more private interchange from the patron to the astrologer, perhaps? So it wasn't preserved, or at least wasn't copied as much as in France and Italy and other places. I don't know if did you found any other countries or regions where you don't see the activity so much?
Yes, it's an equal. I didn't find any annual predictions in Portugal, but at least preserved in what I could find. It's not the only case. In fact, there's not much in Spain either. We know there are activities. We know some astrologers who wrote annual predictions went there, in Salamanca, for instance. But we don't preserve any predictions. That might be because it didn't find collectors to copy them. Even in France, actually, we don't have much. In France, we have the suspicion that maybe the milieu in Paris wasn't very
Friendly.
astrology friendly. Yes, at the time, it was in the 14th century, maybe not so much in the 15th. Although we also have traces of astrological practice with people like Simon Farr. So there should have been some predictions. We don't always know why. We know that universities were a place to make annual predictions, because in most places in the 15th century, it became one of the charges of the astrology professor. He was asked to make a public predictions each year, and that was then copied and given to copy, so that would help to preserve it. It's the case in Italy and in Poland, especially. In Germany, it's a little more complicated because we don't have much manuscripts, but we have lots of printed predictions, which is probably related to the fact that the printing techniques went there first. So, but it's not always easy. One of my proposition would be that we have collectors, mostly in the places where we didn't have much circulation of predictions. So that would explain why they would collect them. In Spain, there's Hernán Colón in the Sevilla library, who collected printed predictions, but very large amount of printed predictions. But that's an hypothesis.
Well, it is strange to know that other countries don't have, because in Portugal we had this event, and we tend to attribute everything to this event. It's the earthquake of 1755, and so all that's lost. People say, "Oh, it was lost in the earthquake," but probably not, because yes, it was catastrophic. We had a big earthquake, but we cannot just use the earthquake to everything to everything that is lost or disappeared or never existed, and that the people would say it's the earthquake, but I don't know, probably not. So it is interesting to know that in other countries we also have few evidences, and they didn't have the earthquake, so they cannot blame the earthquake.
Yeah, obviously there were lots of occasions in the past where such documents could be lost, and if while working on printed predictions, so in the 1480s, it would be it is probable that these predictions were printed at least in 3,000 exemplaries, because that would be the minimum for the editor to make them worth what they. And we preserve one copy, one exemplary, maybe sometimes 2 or 3, but very more. So lots of them were destroyed, and that's not that surprising, because it was perishable material. So at the end of the year, will you really preserve the calendar for the last year?
No, exactly.
No,
exactly.
exactly.
Or the newspaper
Yes.
that just throw away after or recycle after a couple of days. Yes. And did you notice a change in sophistication, at least in how the material is presented from the shift from manuscript to print? Because a lot of the diagrams and the complexity of the presentation of the calculations, it's not always easy to do on print.
Yes.
Did you notice that kind of change?
Not that much, actually. There isn't in the printed prognostications. The woodcuts are arriving, but only in the 1490s. That's probably Lichtenberger's prognostications. He printed it with lots of woodcuts, and it had a huge success, and then everyone wanted to have woodcuts. But before that, we don't find them. We find more often diagrams in manuscripts.
Yes.
But it might be a technique, the fact that it's more complicated to print when you're not, especially at the beginning of the printing, might be costly for not much.
Expensive, perhaps also.
Yeah, I think it was difficult in the beginning of print to print like a table or something that had many numbers, and they had to borrow from other office workshops, because they didn't have those many numbers for instance, a table. One of the things I noticed in the manuscript I have studied is that it includes a segment of John of Saxony's commentary. And in the end, it has 2 example horoscopes. And in the printed version, it has only 1. So it's very interesting. It's the same example, but the second example is not there. So yes, they sometimes they try to, I don't know, save space or
have limited funds. For printing.
So something is lost.
Yes, because I was also asking this because we see here in Portuguese example, which is the one I'm most familiar with, we do see a difference in the very expensive almanacs, which do present 1 or 2 diagrams, and then the simplest, cheapest almanacs will only have text, sometimes not even a diagram or the chart of the year, or not. They would mention it, write it, describe it, but they do not have not even the diagram. That's what I was asking. So if you would see that kind of shift, and apparently it happens. So the diagrams and the woodcuts appear much later in the printing process.
I think maybe the woodcuts made it easier to represent something visually. So they became very popular.
Yes, that's also a change in the content of the predictions. The way they are manuscript predictions, they are very scientific, if we can say, in the sense that they are made by astrologers with lots of astronomical considerations and authoritative quotations. And in fact, it's difficult to think they were easy to read by someone else than an astrologer. So we can suppose that princes at their own astrologers read the prediction and tell them if it was accurate or not. With print, well, at the beginning of print, it's very similar. I believe that print was used in the same way, just as a way to copy the manuscript predictions. But in the 1490s, I think that the change is Lichtenberger's prognostication at Wiggintianus. It was not it was a mix of astrological material and not so and prophecy, diverse prophecies. It was widely popular, although astrologers didn't like it much because it wasn't very scientific. In their opinion, we have Paul of Middelburg, who was copied by Lichtenberger. He made a reclamation against him, but it was sold. It was selling. So for the editors, the publishers find that it was a good mean to finance other treatises. So that made the predictions go more public to something that could be sold more widely. And woodcuts were a part of that, and limiting authority quotations was also a part of that. And even sometimes not being so serious about astronomical positions and so on.
Yes, they were more
they were downgraded,
sensationalist,
yes,
for
scientific.
less knowledgeable people, public. Yeah. Okay.
So returning a bit to all the wonderful manuscripts that you can see every day in your life, is there any, I know that you have no time to look at all of them, but are you aware of some particularly interesting manuscript that has not yet been studied, something that regarding astrology? Well, I know there are, I have been in a Bibliothèque nationale de France, and I have asked to see quite a few some years ago, and they are all wonderful, I have to say. They are all beautiful, and I could just take them home if they left me, but they didn't. So I think they are all extremely interesting and relevant. But are there any group of manuscripts or a particular manuscript that you think it should really be the object of study regarding astrology?
I think there's still much to do with manuscripts from the Bibliothèque nationale. One of the difficulties is that this segment of the collection, especially the manuscripts that were in the King Library, so before the French Revolution, and came directly to us, it's the part that wasn't, it was catalogued in the 18th century, and it hasn't been much updated since. And obviously it's a huge work to update the catalogue of all these manuscripts, which means that there are still some things we don't know inside them. So David just wrote a catalogue for astrological manuscripts in the Bibliothèque nationale, and it's pretty extensive, and it's also very impressive for all he could do. But it's a catalogue, and beside that, I think there's a lot of work to do, a lot of study to do if you go further deeper in the manuscripts.
Yes, I know of David's work, and I think it's wonderful. It's a very impressive work, as you said. But still, I've been talking to David from I don't know, from the beginning of my PhD, and he himself says that they need more research, because they are hundreds of manuscripts, so they do need more research. It's a lot of work, but I think it's a very I like it very much. So I think it's a very good a good thing to do, to be able to study these manuscripts deeply and to be dedicate ourselves just to this study.
Yeah. Do you have any current research or research projects coming up?
Well, I have some minor research projects because actually it's well, it's very. I'm very lucky to work at the Bibliothèque nationale, but I don't have as much time as I'd like to work on the collection. Also, lots of librarianship projects, digitizing, and even cataloging we need to do. I'm trying to work on the horoscopes as diagrams, the astrological squares, and that's very new to me. But well, I didn't progress much until now. But I think there are different types of diagrams. For what I've seen in annual predictions, there are several uses. In annual prediction, sometimes you have the astrological square, but it's empty. So it means the copyist wanted to, he found it was important to have an astrological square, but in the end he didn't copy it. So, and on the other hand, in almanacs, for instance, sometimes you have the table of positions, of planetary positions for the months, and in March you have the square for the equinox. It's completely filled, and it seems that like a working tool. The astrologer thought, well, if I have the square, even without writing a predictions, I will have all the info I need further. There are also several forms. Richard Ruissian, but he's not the only one, is having double horoscopes. So he's having the astrological positions for the event he's working on, and he's also having just outside the position for the CZG just before that.
Oh yes, oh yes.
It's obviously very useful for astrological interpretation, but I wonder if that's something he invented. Probably not, because I saw that some other places. And if there are several types of diagrams, and what does that mean of the relation between the astronomical calculations and the astrological interpretation?
You mean if he invented the visual form or the idea?
The visual form.
Oh yes, because as you know, there was this ongoing discussion about what is more effective, the introitum or the CZG that repeated it. So maybe they were just trying to mix both. And
yes, probably, because in most cases, astrologers or authors of annual predictions finally use both because
yes,
it's sure. You have anything to need.
It's better to use everything.
Yes.
To be sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So this is not. You said this is a minor project. It's not a minor project. It's a very complex project. Yes. The one that you're.
It will require a lot of research to see all the variants and how they appear through time, which is quite interesting. And have you published your thesis, or will you publish? Do you have any plans?
I read parts of it.
Not yet. Well, it's available.
It is.
As I defended it, is available online. I'd like to publish it at some point, but I didn't have time yet. So I hope to be able to do that shortly.
Yes. I hope so. I read parts of it, as I said, and I think it's a very important contribution for the story, the history of astrology in general and astrological techniques, because this is what our main focus is, the history of astrological techniques. So please do.
I will work on it.
Okay, thank you.
Yes,
So, yes.
okay.
Uh,
well,
Oh, thank you.
thank you for sharing your research and your findings here at the podcast.
Thank you for
It was a
inviting
pleasure
me.
talking to you.
Yes.
And we will say goodbye for now.
Yes, and hope to have you back at some point. If you wanted to discuss any document that you find interesting or anything
An
that you would like to
article.
share, an article that would be
An article,
great.
a book, or a passage of your PhD thesis. Well, you're very welcome. It doesn't have to be like a formal interview. It could be a shorter podcast. Anything that you would like to discuss, please let us know.
Sure, I will keep it in mind.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank
we'll say
you.
goodbye for now.